Hello and welcome to Shop Talk Live. On the panel this afternoon, we have Arun Prasad. Arun is the head of product marketing for Nissan at Nissan for passenger vehicles. Eric Hannon, who's the partner at McKinsey & Company, and John Eichberger, who's executive director of the Fuels Institute. Dan, over to you.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Shop Talk Live, the future of transportation. And I'd like to welcome our guests, Eric Hannon and John Eichberger, to join us. Arun Prasad is on his way, I think. And we should get started. First of all, we always like to welcome the audience. We do these most Fridays at 2 p.m. UK time. We tend to get quite a big global audience because of some of the interesting speakers that kindly join us. And today is no exception. 22 countries tuning in. So thank you for taking the time. And as we go through the next 45 minutes, please do put your questions to us by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom, and then I'll feed them through to the panel as we go. So as many questions as possible, and I promise I'll try to get to most of them. I guess the big question, guys, at the beginning of this session is, what has changed? How much has the pandemic impacted upon the future plans of OEMs and generally for the transportation industry? Eric, I don't know whether you'd like to answer that one first.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think it goes without saying that we've seen unprecedented drop in sales over the past several months, and now we're starting to see the recovery and what a recovery looks like, right? It's clear that China is leading the recovery and that they're starting to bounce back first, right? We're seeing a little bit, and if we take them as a template for maybe the way the rest of the world follows thereafter, right? What we see is a couple of things. We see that the demand came back rather quickly because of, number one, a bunch of pent-up demand while everything was closed down, and number two, people actually diverting from shared and from public transport, right? So Didi and has just been decimated, right? And as they come back, they're still sitting around 70% of their previous total, while vehicle sales have jumped back up. So it does seem that people are diverting from shared to private vehicles because of a concern for health, right? And so if that's any marker of the way we're going to see the rest of the world come back, right, we would expect to see, at least short-term, customers really shifting towards private transport.
Yeah, so in the cities, public transport is, under pressure, I guess, because of changes. John, what have you seen in terms of a big shift since the start of the pandemic?
Yeah, I think I've seen exactly what Eric just said. We had a conference a couple of weeks ago, and we had Deloitte come on and talk about the Consumer Global Survey. And I think we've seen some of the trends leading into 2020. Some of the shine seems to come off of shared mobility. The number of respondents said they use shared mobility at least once a week went down a lot. The interest in owning a personal vehicle had also grown. With the pandemic, you're seeing a huge increase. About 2/3 or more of consumers in almost every country that they're surveying right now are saying they're going to limit their use of public transport or mass or shared ride vehicles for the next 3 months or even longer. We'll see how long that lasts. But the importance of having a personal vehicle, that safety, that cocoon of I'm in control of my health and safety, was much more important to the majority of the consumers they interviewed. So I think we're going to see those trends continue for at least in the foreseeable future. We'll see how it bounces back. In terms of the OEMs, we had Guidehouse on looking at the electric vehicle market. Their forecast for 2025, they have shown a dip. They think it's going to take this big V because they're going to lose a huge percentage of production this year, but they believe they're going to hit that same mark in 2025. So they think the market's going to come back pretty quickly. Opus, IHS Market thinks that the oil market's going to come back by third quarter this year. So it's an interesting dynamic. Now, if there's a second wave, whole different situation. But I think we've seen some trends accelerate, but overall, the trajectory of the market seems to be consistent as what it was before the pandemic.
Very interesting. Now, Arun, if I can welcome you to Shop Talk Live. Thank you, by the way, Arun, for sending me through some of that, some of your thoughts, for my pre-reading. I've been up since early hours this morning thinking about some of the things you sent, which were pretty thought-provoking. I suppose some of the headline points that you made were you know, facts on the ground. That it was obviously looking at Tesla's valuation, looking at Nikola's valuation, looking at the deal with Ford, and you know, the VW, which was another big development. From your perspective as an OEM, you know, do you agree with some of the things that have been said? Do you have a different view of what's changed?
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Sorry for being late. Just some technology issues that we have had. So what I sent you primarily stems from the primary fact, right? All of the OEMs now are under heavy pressure for capital. No, we are in trouble in a way. Once the market went down, we did not, for example, in UK, we did not wholesale a car for 2 months. That's your only lifeline of money coming into the company. So if that's not there, then what's happening is we are forced to take some really hard decisions. No, so we are answering some questions probably we wouldn't have to answer in so long before than when the eventuality come. For example, from a complete OEM perspective, do we have to develop an operating system for our car in-house, or should we go and buy it from a technology company? No, Google or Amazon, Android Auto, et cetera, right? So from that perspective, and if you just push that further, then that's where the partnerships come in. No, we would have done it ourselves. Many of us would have done it ourselves if you have the capital. Yes. No, usually it's Apple model. You just develop everything in-house, then you have the bigger pie to eat. But we have to look for opportunities, and that's what Ford and Volkswagen has done. And in the alliance, we announced as well that we are going to follow a leader-follower strategy, where Renault or Nissan will develop one set of platforms, and then we will use it among the alliance, et cetera, et cetera. So that's on the OEM side. And on the consumer side, I completely agree with what Eric and John has been talking about, right? I mean, personally, I'm a marketeer, product marketeer. So we are testing some hypotheses. All those customers who are going to buy the cars now, for example, because of the COVID, who never thought they will buy a car. So now, will there be stickiness with them? No. Once you get used to having a personal car, you go to the supermarket in the weekend, you don't have to walk anymore, you don't have to carry anymore. After COVID, will you really give up the car, or will you keep it? No. I mean, there are interesting questions like that we are asking. We don't have an answer yet, but again, asking these questions and developing the hypothesis is as interesting as answer itself. Yeah.
Do you see? I mean, we'll come to this perhaps a bit more in different questions, but just staying on you, Aaron, for a minute. Do you see as a dichotomy between different parts of the world in terms of both, in terms of the consumer reaction, and also, I guess, the experience with COVID? Because obviously, if you compare Australia, I know it's a small market, with the UK, there's a huge difference in the experience of the consumer, if you like, of the health crisis, but also probably the economic crisis, at least domestically. Do you think that's a factor in your calculations as well?
Definitely, Dan. No, we share notes among people from US, for example, or colleagues in Japan. I mean, when we go to the meetings, we all have a very different bias, no, like with how much our country is affected. No, when I talk to somebody in Japan, they come back with a very different model because they were shut down for a couple of weeks and then they came out. While compared to somebody in Italy, for example, or in UK even, that we were shut down for a longer period. So yes, and then that also forms the next point is the regulation, no? For example, will the US going to support the regulatory stuff when we come out, what we call a green recovery, like what we believe Europe will do? No, we saw it in Germany, we see it in France, and we are hoping that it will be the same in UK. So that if that green recovery is going to help us in things like electrification, for example, and if US takes a completely different view, then you never know, right? Because still, I personally believe that yes, electrification is great, but to make electrification successful, at least for the next 2-3 years, we need a big government support to move this forward.
Well, let's take that point, because right, it was in the agenda, but let's take it now because I think it's a key one. So Eric first, and then John. Eric, you know, do you think that's right? You know, do you see this government's policy interventions as being absolutely critical as far as driving EV growth is concerned?
I think it is critical, but I don't think it's the only factor, right? So we've had already in China and Europe specifically good support for EVs, right? The regulatory environment is already EV favorable and getting only more favorable. And we've seen that through the pandemic, EV sales have been more resilient than traditional sales, right? So during the pandemic, or before the pandemic, we were sitting about 3%, roughly a little bit less than 3% of sales in Europe were EVs, and that hit nearly 6% through the pandemic, right? So we, as a share, even though we've got an absolute drop, right, because they dropped like everything dropped, as far as the share, they've been more resilient and they've stolen share. So even without that fundamental regulatory support, we are seeing still a trend towards electrification. I'm with Arun, though, that the moves that we're seeing through the European Green Deal and through the rescue funds, and I mean, obviously what Germany did is going to incredibly support the EV industry with the mandatory chargers and the increase in subsidies. That is going to significantly help, and that's going to significantly drive even more volume. But it does seem, and maybe Arun is a good person to comment on this after John goes, it does seem that right now we're actually going to be, because of all that support, we're going to be volume constrained, right? We just can't crank out anymore. We see the battery plants in Eastern Europe struggling to keep up with demand, right? And so it's going to be supply constrained, not demand constrained with that type of support, probably.
Very interesting. John, would you like to come on that one as well?
Yeah, I think, there's clearly trends going that's making electric vehicles much more attractive to consumers. Take example from an environmental perspective. The satellite images we saw during the height of the shutdown is a clear indication that criteria pollutant emissions from internal combustion engines are a massive contributor to air pollution. And when we pull them off the road, air pollution almost disappeared, yet the utility plants are still running. So the argument that electric vehicles are dirty because they're taking it from power plants is pretty much washed away. So you've got a situation now where electric vehicles could actually be seen by more people as a potential solution rather than the red herring of their problem. I think the cost is a major issue. And I think in the next 5 years, they're going to be cost competitive without government supports. But I do believe between now and then, government support is absolutely critical. The growth of EVs in China and Europe versus the United States under a current policy direction is a clear indication. And we had a speaker at our conference again who said that they're monitoring certain OEMs who are changing their deployment strategies for EVs from North America to those markets where there are regulatory requirements compelling them to comply. And they're getting credits or getting more incentives to bring those vehicles to Europe, to Asia, rather than North America. So I do believe that government, for at least for the next 5-7 years, is going to be critically important to the growth of this market. Ultimately, it'll be a choice of the consumer, but we're still a ways away from that being the factor.
And that, I guess, that government policy could change in the US if there's depending on the election results in November, right, John?
Yeah. If the administration changes, if the president is replaced and the Senate is replaced, the constraints on the environmental agenda pretty much go away, and I think the acceleration of electrification will gain a lot of traction over the next 4 years. So first week of November is going to be critically important to what happens to electrification in North America.
Well, we've discussed, I guess, some differences between different parts of the world in terms of policy interventions. But let's just for a moment think about urban cities, urban spaces. Eric, you spend a lot of time focusing on what's happening in some of the top 100 cities globally in these areas. Given that, we've seen a huge increase, which McKinsey have documented in last mile delivery, which is going to lead to a huge increase, is leading to a huge increase in delivery traffic in these top 100 cities. I think McKinsey mentioned a figure, 30%, 36% increase. How do policymakers who are keen to green the recovery or press the big green reset, however you would phrase it, how do they balance, how do they do that on the basis that actually one of the big impacts of COVID towards growing last mile has actually will create a much bigger problem in those urban areas?
Yeah, so I don't think the regulatory environment has caught up yet with the growth that we've seen through COVID of a lot of last mile delivery. And I'm not sure we should react that fast, right? Regulation should be slow, I think, because we don't know how long-term these trend changes are, right? Do people now enjoy getting food delivered to them rather than going out to restaurants? Is that going to be a long-term trend, or is that going to revert once we're over the hump of the pandemic, right? So how much of this is really here to stay is an open question. I think regardless of if we revert back to the mean or if we fundamentally change, we do know though that last mile trends are going to force a lot more congestion in cities, as well as a lot of the trends around private vehicle. And some of the trends we're discussing right now out of the pandemic of people feeling more secure in private vehicles rather than public transport. And then perhaps shifting to shared instead of public transport is also going to put a burden on congestion. And so we are going to have a fundamental issue that cities are going to have to deal with, which is the need to push people into high density, more trunk, high density transport, so public transport, in order just to make the streets navigable. I mean, the trends that we're seeing in China are worrisome, right? We had finally started to see trends that offered some kind of hope around the congestion in China, and now this flood towards private vehicles, it just goes the wrong way. So as long as this trend maintains, we are going to have to, the only way to attack that is through regulatory measures, probably.
But it might be best to let the dust settle, if you like, before flying in
overreact.
With regulation. What about, John, we did a webinar the other week and you mentioned something which really got my attention, which was looking at obviously the impact potentially on the growth of telecommuting. I mean, we've all seen, you know, businesses realize how efficient it can be to work for many of their employees to work from home and they stay in business. You brought up a fact, I think, about the high percentage of people who could work from home, and if they did all work from home one day a week, the impact that could have. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, it could be a massive impact. So we have an ongoing research project right now, getting ready to go to peer review here in the next couple of weeks. And our researchers looked at, said, you know, according to University of Chicago, about 37% of the workforce in the United States has the ability to do their job from home. So your pool is 37%. If that 37% were to work from home one day a week, you reduce overall emissions by 5%. And there's almost no cost to the environment. There's savings. There's no cost to the economy. There's savings to the economy. So there's a huge factor there. And I think, you know, my parent company, Nax, has a pretty strong we're not working from home policy. And that may be up for grabs now. And I think a lot of organizations have put in place, we're not going to work from home, we're not going to telecommute. They've been forced to accept Zoom and Teams and everything into their world, and they're realizing their employees are still productive, and their employees are probably a little higher job satisfaction. So are they going to reevaluate their need to have large footprints? Is that going to change the urban landscape? Are you going to see them abandoning the massive office complexes, go to more remote locations and smaller footprints? All that stuff could dramatically change the impact and the nature of transportation. We'll see how long this glow of telecommuting lasts, because there's a big concern about corporate culture when you're not in the same building, not seeing one another. But we'll see how it goes. But there is a potential there to have a dramatic impact on consumption of fuel, on emissions, and change the whole landscape of the urban environment. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Yeah, very interesting. Let's turn to the next topic, which is autonomous. And perhaps, Aaron, we could come to you on this, obviously looking at this from an OEM's perspective. I mean, it seems to me, I mean, I think this is something you said when I interviewed you a few months ago, Eric, although it seems like years ago, doesn't it? But it was only a few months ago, back in March, that we published the interview you did with us. And I think the point you made there about autonomous was that it was very much what you're seeing is a bottom-up approach, with gradual evolution as opposed to dramatic change as far as highway automation AI is concerned. Aaron, would you like to comment on that from, you know, Nissan's perspective?
Sure, Dan. There are two aspects of looking at autonomous from a OEM, any OEM, not only Nissan, but any OEM perspective, right? One is the technological capability that we can develop as OEMs, the investments that we need, the partnerships we need, the software we need, et cetera, and then the regulatory stuff as well. Now, today, for example, it's very hard to implement a hands-off level 2, for example, autonomy in many cities even today. No, the regulatory stuff is not there. And if you even go further, level 3, for example, who takes the onus of, if there's an accident, who takes the onus of insurance, for example? No? So there are a lot of interesting questions to be solved on the regulatory stuff. And because we have the COVID and there is a looming economic crisis, and then all the capital is going to be from the governments are going to be forced in restarting the economy, I think the focus is going to be on and also on emissions. The focus is going to be on these areas than autonomy for now. No, so that's going to slow down a bit on the first side from an external point of view. From internal point of view, as I said before, every development that we make today is going to have a razor focus on how much return on investment we can bring. No. Would anybody just pay to go on a $5,000 or $3,000 just to go on a highway without touching the steering wheel, but you have to still watch the road? No, it's interesting questions. We have ourselves in my cars, we have a semi-autonomous system. We give it a standard in some vehicles. People love it once they start using it, but we do see the initial reluctance to say, should I pay for it? No, so that's always there. So until that point, I think there is going to be a bottom-up approach, if we want to call it that way, that we are going to slowly add component by component to help people get used to it, to improve the safety of the vehicle, and then finally find a commercial solution for it. And I think the biggest commercial solution is more on the sharing economy once it opens up. No, I think that's where the economy of scale is, because today probably a fully autonomous car will cost you between $100,000 to $150,000 instead of a $25,000 or 25,000 pounds a basic vehicle that anybody needs. No, so that's where I think the economic side is also needs to work. I believe in autonomous.
So we might be bullish on farming robots and pizza delivery, but not on autonomous for highways in the near term, medium term.
Definitely, if you talk to any engineer, they'll tell you, you reduce the speed of a vehicle, then use cases become much easier to solve. Now, so yeah, cleaning ice in the roads, etc., garbage trucks. Now there are applications that you can find, but passenger vehicle is very complex in my opinion.
You know, Dan, Eric, you were talking about last mile, and one of the conversations we've had a lot is the use of autonomous devices, whether they be drones, whether they be droids like from Star Wars, or vehicles to do last mile delivery. And we were having a conversation just the other day, and you know, with the COVID pandemic, so many Amazon trucks going up and down my road every single day. Mm-hmm. What's to stop them from showing up, parking at the end of my complex, releasing a whole bunch of droids to deliver them, come back to the van, then move on? So autonomy has so many different levels of it. It'd be interesting how that plays out. Eric, have you guys looked at anything like that in terms of last mile delivery?
Yeah, and that is the one, I think that is the one bright spot in autonomy, if there's any bright spot through the pandemic, right? Is there, you saw a rush to allow all types of pilots for delivery and for last mile delivery. So there's a lot of startups, and I won't name any of them specifically here, but a quick Google search finds them all, who were allowed to try and do low speed deliveries in cities. And that seems to be, being allowed to do that has accelerated a bit through the pandemic, recognizing that contact, you know, not only is it potentially more efficient, as you were mentioning, John, but it also opens up contactless delivery, right? So when we're worried about transferring a disease, contactless delivery is also helpful. Because as Arun mentioned, or maybe it was Dan, you know, by reducing the speeds greatly, that opens up a ton more use cases. I think we had, before the pandemic, I think we had a reckoning coming for autonomy anyway, right? There was a lot of the hope around autonomy was that it looked like Moore's law from a capability point of view. But what we were seeing, it seemed before the pandemic, was that supervised machine learning was looking more like an S-curve rather than exponential, and that we were starting to top out. And if we really want to get to full autonomy in passenger, that we needed the next S-curve, and then that next S-curve was going to be billions, right? So we had a reckoning coming anyway. Looked like we were probably going to be 10 years away. And now, due to the capital cash crunch in the automotive industry, some of the billions that we needed are disappearing. So it is one area where I think from a passenger point of view, we do decelerate, but there's the potential for acceleration when it comes to goods. Definitely.
Yeah, I could bring in a question from the audience, perhaps to Aaron on that point of investment. So the question is, in 2019, 300 billion euros was expected to be invested by the OEMs in the next 5 to 10 years to develop the EV sector. is that still the plan despite COVID-19, you know, to make those huge investments into EVs by the OEM?
I mean, yeah, sure, Dan. Without putting any numbers, still, I don't think we can survive as any automotive manufacturer without investing in one way or the other in EV. No, that's the fact, right? We, as we mentioned before, a new company we just launched with 2 years from now, deliveries the stocks can skyrocket, right? So that's how bullish the general environment is, which means we have to follow what the customers need. And there are a lot of applications still not understood in EV, for example, as Eric mentioned about the last mile delivery. It's very interesting that if we replace, for example, here even in London, if you replace an ICE vehicle with the last mile delivery electric vehicle, suddenly you save 30 pounds a day for the congestion charge, for example, right? So there is a lot of economic factor to go in to play. So I don't think the EV is the priority that's going to be there until we find some other technology that's going to eat it, in my opinion. So that, yeah, the short answer is yes, the investments will continue.
Yeah. I mean, from an industry point of view, the amount of investment was directly related to the risk of fines, right? So, I mean, the amount of investment in EVs was buffering the amount of fines, and the EU Commission has made it very clear that the pandemic is not going to at all abate the rate at which the emissions requirements are accelerating over the next 10 years. So the investments have to be that large to be able to sell cars without a burden of massive fines.
Yeah, definitely, Eric. It's very hard for us now not to think about the penalty at least in one side of any strategy that we take. No, it becomes part of the strategy now. That how do you manage them? Yeah.
You know, in the United States, you take a look at more than half of the electric vehicles sold in the United States are sold in California, and the majority of the rest are sold in the other 11 states have adopted a zero emission vehicle program. So the deployment is all based upon compliance at this point. Now, again, as I said before, it's going to get to a point where consumers are going to demand these, and then you're going to have much more broadly available models. But that impact on mitigating fines is so important across the globe, as you guys both said.
Let's talk about charging infrastructure. Now, John, you've recently at the Fuels Institute released a report, and some of that report at least is really looking at the significance of charging infrastructure. And I think in the report you make the point that perhaps the convenience and utility of that infrastructure hasn't always been considered carefully enough. Would you like to sort of talk a little bit about the importance of the development of this infrastructure?
Yes, we commissioned this report and ICF wrote it for us. And the whole idea was, it was funny, the board asked us to do a report on electric vehicles. I kind of laughed. They said, what can we do that 1,000 other reports haven't already done? And it challenged our team to say, okay, we need to really focus on a unique set. And we really looked at infrastructure and optimum siting of infrastructure, capacity of infrastructure. And what we learned was, you know, in the United States, there's like 22,000 level 2 chargers, only 4,000 DC fast chargers. Well, if we get to a situation where EVs become mass adoption, those individuals living in multi-unit dwellings where they may not have access to a garage or a charger at their residence are going to need an opportunity charger in the market. And they're not going to want to spend 8 hours parked there. They're going to want a DC fast charger. So the deployment of these higher rate chargers needs to be a higher level of strategy for the overall market. And the kind of commentary in the report was, up until now, it was all about get the infrastructure out there. Let's not worry about how strong the charge is, because there's not very many EVs in the market. The utility rate's not going to be very high. Nobody's going to be using them, but we need to get them in the market to say they're there. Well, now we need to shift, say we need to actually deploy an infrastructure system that matches consumer needs, matches vehicle capabilities, so that we can get a meaningful charge in 5 to 10 minutes. And you know, the Fuels Institute earlier this year launched an electric vehicle council. The whole purpose is to get the different groups together, the retailers, the equipment providers, the OEMs, the utility companies, the regulators, start talking about what are the fundamentals necessary to make a charging business viable, so that we can actually build out the infrastructure in a pro-business case and make it viable for the consumer over the next 15 to 20 years. So they kind of go hand to hand.
That's pretty interesting. Eric and Aaron, perhaps I can sort of slightly redirect this same question to you. Do you think, I mean, looking at, and I have a lot of personal experience of the Norwegian market over a number of years, and seeing how that's changed a bit, or the view has changed a bit in terms of, you know, the importance of some of the things that John mentioned in terms of, you know, the convenience of fast charging. Have you seen, do you think there's an evolution of that view as far as the importance of charging infrastructure is concerned? Do you subscribe to that view?
Sorry, go ahead, Eric. No problem. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So I think we've actually gotten to a point, I think there might be a little bit of a W story to this. You know, early on, a lack of infrastructure was a huge barrier for a lot of people, and you only had early adopters. We've gotten to the point in the market where actually the infrastructure does not seem to be the constraining factor anymore. When you look at the data, the number of chargers per person has little correlation to the EV penetration in areas where we have high EV penetration today. I think the question for the industry long term, and here's where it'd be interesting to see Arun's opinion from the industry view, is how long is that true? Because right now we're still in a relatively early adopter phase where most people have private infrastructure available to them, right? So as we move into a phase where you have more people who don't have dedicated spots overnight to park in or dedicated chargers to themselves, does infrastructure become a constraining factor again? But as of today, right now, currently, it looks like it isn't, at least that's from a European point of view. Sorry,
yeah, definitely, Eric. I mean, I'll add on to that, right? As you said, we see like 3 different markets, very, very nascent market where electric vehicles are not sold that many. Then there is a charging problem because nobody is putting a charging infrastructure, etc. And then you have a market like many markets in the Europe, for example. We have considerable size of electric vehicles, but it's not overwhelming. So you still get a place, not a lot of waiting when you go to charge, etc., etc. And then you get to places like Norway, where you see a queue in the charging stations, where then you ask the question, do we need more charging infrastructure? Yes, completely understand. The real problem to solve from OEM point of view is the biggest question. I think today people won't buy a car in London or in Paris, for example, is that they live in a flat. No, they don't have a place to charge their car, and they cannot rely just on the fast charging for them to sustain the car economically. Now, if we can solve that problem, and that's where I think where the government has to step in and say, convert many of the parking base in the cities into even a slow charging for the night, that's going to go a long way in adapting EVs today than putting a 150 kilowatt charger, for example, that would sell more vehicles, yeah, in my opinion.
Well, this has happened, of course, in Norway. You see a lot of multi-story car parks, you know, with fast chargers, but also, you know, lower capacity chargers for overnight charging. So I guess it's also a commercial opportunity, right, for the owners of those you know, those units as well. Going forward, I mean, one of the big developments I wanted just to flag up in this space is obviously the German announcement, which we were discussing before we went on air, about, you know, the German government mandating that electric charging had to be available at every gas station in Germany. I know this is a policy measure that is still being discussed and not quite finalized, I understand. I don't know whether that's right, Eric, but do you think this was a pretty important step, interesting step?
I mean, I think at a minimum it sends a signal to the German population that it's okay for everybody to buy an EV now, and it's going to be really interesting to see how the regulation is developed and how it's rolled out. Because when you look at least in the German market today, where would we really need that type of infrastructure is it's really the on-highway, which we're still building out the highway, and there's on-highway, there's quite a few companies, especially the collaboration between OEMs who are building out the on-highway charging. But every single corner little gas station with a charger probably actually doesn't help that much, right? Because those are in areas where people have plentiful charging. So I'm hoping that when the regulation comes out, there is a graduated requirement so that it doesn't equally blanket everybody. Because I think one of the tough things about electrification is if you have a whole bunch of chargers sitting there empty all the time, right? So if you have, you know, yeah, okay, in Norway, overutilization may be a problem, but underutilization is also a problem because that's a capital asset that we've put in the ground. It's underutilized. It sends a signal that electrification isn't taking off as people had hoped, right? And so I hope that the regulatory environment ends up where we can deploy the chargers where they're going to be needed most rather than just a blanket requirement.
Yeah, I agree with Eric on that one. Sorry, Dan. I agree with Eric on that one because I think it would be more effective to put, in my opinion, a charger in every supermarket where people will spend some considerable time to help us than putting it in a fuel station, for example, in the cities especially. Yeah.
John, what's your view on that development? Because obviously it's something which is, you know, you'd be thinking about from your perspective.
So I've got two probably comments to make. One, from a U.S. perspective, there's 150,000 gas stations, and we're working with a lot of companies trying to get chargers at those convenience store gas stations at a capacity that matches that business model. So the idea is, why make people have to change their travel behavior if they still need to get electricity? If they can get a meaningful charge in 10 minutes, why not put it where they're already going? Clearly, they're getting put in grocery stores and shopping malls. That's happening already. But how can we make it a little more convenient on every single corner? The German announcement is very interesting because it got a lot of attention. But I also always take every single government statement and announcement with a huge grain of skepticism. If you think back a couple of years ago, the UK and France said we're going to ban petrol vehicles by 2040. Well, that was a 25-year timeline. How many administrations, how many prime ministers are going to change in those countries over the next 25 years? How consistent is that policy? And they also exempted hybrid vehicles from that ban. Well, hybrids are petroleum-based vehicles. So you have to look at the details. As Eric said, we got to see how this regulation is written, how it plays out. My guess is it's not going to be nearly as dramatic as the announcement comes across, but the message, as Eric said, is clear. It is a powerful message that we need to build out the infrastructure, and we need to make sure that our customers have access to the power they need to drive their vehicles. Personally, I think it's a little overhanded for the government to say, if you want to be in business selling transportation energy, you have to sell this type of energy. I think that is a misplaced government role, but you know, that's the laissez-faire guy in me. So I prefer to let the business, if there's a business to be had, if you can make money with the electric charger, retail is going to put it in, and you don't need the government to tell them to do it. So I think demand will drive supply, but obviously Germany is thinking the other direction.
John, the other thing Germany announced was to double the EV subsidy level in the German market. I think it went from 3,000 euros to 6,000 euros for under 40,000 euro worth of EV. That was a pretty big move as well, I guess. What's your view? I mean, you've done a lot of research on the total cost of ownership. That plays an important part, doesn't it, in the purchase decision?
Absolutely. Consumers, you know, we did a study a couple of years ago, and most of our studies are US based, but I think they're transferable. Consumers buy vehicles based on what they need, what they can afford. And a lot of times people are going to walk away. We did studies on hybrids. They didn't buy hybrids because hybrids are $3,000 or $4,000 more, and they couldn't come up with the ROI over a 5-year period. If you reduce the upfront purchase cost of an electric vehicle, the capabilities are there. They're a blast to drive. They're absolutely fantastic to drive. They have the range people need. They have more than the range they need on a regular basis. And so now they start becoming economically feasible without a sticker shock. That's going to get a lot more people looking at, hey, this is a viable option. It's no longer going to cost me an extra 5,000-6,000 euros. Maybe I should take a look at it because, you know, I want to do what's right for the environment. I want to reduce my total cost of ownership. If I can get that purchase price on par with an ICE, the electric vehicle is a much lower cost vehicle to own. So if that helps bring those into parity, I think you're going to see a significant increase in EV sales in that market.
I mean, as soon as we saw that German government statement, I think literally within 24 hours, we saw the UK government make noises, you know, how they sort of, before it's an absolute government policy, they put it out there as something which could be a government policy. So governments do copy each other, don't they, in these areas, and something like this can spread very rapidly globally. And as you say, John, although these commitments may be so far out that it's difficult to hold the government to account for it, but it does create something of a momentum, doesn't it?
Economic incentives delivered in the short term will have a major impact. Take a look at the United States. The tax credit is $7,500 until you sell 200,000 units. If there's an election shift in November, I suspect that tax credit limit is going to be extended to encourage more sales of electrified vehicles.
Yes.
And that's going to have a major impact.
Aaron, just thinking about Nissan, and I mean, in many ways, Nissan has played one of the key roles globally as an OEM in this space in terms of developing, electric vehicles which are, which are affordable and you've obviously had huge success with the Nissan Leaf globally, and the new model is very exciting in terms of the range capacity. We were just discussing that before we started. How do you feel? I mean, in your job, how do you feel in the current situation? Do you feel optimistic about the future in the direction of your business and the your particular responsibility around EV?
Definitely, Dan. I mean, there are two things here. I would say one is the absolute train of electrification and the government giving the support, etc., etc. That makes anybody who is involved with EV today their life much more easier than 10 years ago. I started in Nashville. I was working in Nissan US in Nashville. I remember trying to sell a few Leafs in Nashville was such a big push. Than today, it's much more easier to do our job. No, so definitely, yeah, that's one thing. The other thing is, I mean, moving out of electrification, there are other various things that are happening in the automotive industry. Connectivity, how do we monetize the data? Cars are going to be the most powerful computers on wheels. So all these things we are still figuring out and grappling, and then you add on to that new business models, such as, okay, how do we do the e-commerce? Once we how do we work with insurance companies? I just see a range of possibilities where you can really experiment. So if you really enjoy experimenting something, then I believe automotive industry is the best place to be, and I feel positive about the industry for the future to come.
Great. Now, this is my optimistic question, where I ask how you feel, Eric. I always do this at the end of interviews, but I mean, you're focusing a lot on the sustainability area and the mobility area at McKinsey. Is this a part of the McKinsey practice which is going to be very busy with clients, do you think, in the next few years?
Yeah, so it does, again, from a European point of view. I know John is often bringing in the North American point of view. So if I pause on the European point of view, it is clear to me, based on the work we're doing with clients right now and the requests from clients, that this is going to be a green recovery this time in Europe, right? That there is a lot of discussion around how to emerge from this pandemic resilient and green. And we've seen through the pandemic, the data that ESG, highly rated ESG firms have done better through the pandemic than low rated ESG firms. And I think there's a recognition of that. We've had a lot of clients reaching out over this time trying to examine their core purpose, right? They've just been decimated, and they believe that their resilience out of the pandemic is going to be related to what their core purpose is. That core purpose now is often being defined around sustainability and sustainability goals long term. So I do believe that we are on the path for a green recovery. And a green recovery then also means that we're going to have better mobility. I am worried about the difficulties that we're having in public transport, right? And public transport as a core lever for improving congestions in cities long term is a problem right now. But when we look at the way that the OEMs are going to come out of this, when we look at the way that the ride-hailing firms and the new last mile modes are being developed, I do believe that we have the right trajectory for coming out of this the right way this time. Rather than when I compare it to the the Great Recession, right? We really quickly bounced back to previous levels of CO2, previous levels of congestion and emissions. I have high hopes that this time will be different.
Well, I'm sure that's true. Interestingly, if you watch if you look at some of the notes that people like the president of Toyota sent to their shareholders, it really has that kind of a change of tone in it, doesn't it? Around a green recovery, or also a business with purpose. John, how about you? Is this something which you share the same sentiments on in terms of worldview?
I do. I think the go-to-market strategy, I think the corporate social responsibility, the ESG, is going to be much more top of mind. I think from the COVID example, from the social unrest that started in the United States, it's being mimicked in some other countries, I think you're going to see a much higher level of corporate responsibility and attention to detail. I think from an environmental perspective, I think it's an opportunity. And I view the coronavirus shutdown really as a temporary blip, but it is resetting people's mindsets. You know, they've spent more time at home, a lot more introspection in the last couple months. And I think it's going to result in a different corporate strategy going forward. And it's going to have a major impact on the transportation market. May not be immediate, but I think long term, I think the way that we move from place to place is going to evolve into a much more sustainable model.
Yeah, and right, you know, the great thing about problems is that it does sometimes create the kind of thinking that takes us to a whole new, you know, a whole new level, doesn't it? You know, so it's important to see the very strong positives in this, isn't it? Yeah. Well, guys, you know, I'd like to thank you very much for spending 45 minutes with us, and you know, it's as ever, it's you know, a great pleasure to talk to you. We'll be coming back to mobility again soon. It's one of the big issues in you know, in many of our subscribers' minds, the Global C-Store Focus. So thank you very much for taking the time, and you know, we'll look forward to talking to you again.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again to today's panel, Aaron, Eric, John. Just before we close today, just like to draw your attention to what's coming next week on Friday the 19th of June. We're back with petrol stations, not talking about mobility next week. We're talking about a virtual store tour to a new store that the Maxwell in Ireland recently opened at Clare Castle. We're going to try something a little bit different. We've all been missing doing store visits, so we're going to do a virtual store tour with a video pre-watch on that store before we talk to the CEO, Brian Donaldson, about the operators around these days. And this store was opened just before the pandemic really took hold. And then we're going to move to a broader debate looking at the future of forecourt design, which is taking in many of the some of the topics that we've been discussing around technology and changed consumer behaviors. And we've invited on Craig Phillipson, MD at Shopworks, and Joe Boner of Boner Design Lab to talk about their future vision for forecourt design. And that's just one slide from the presentation they'll be giving as part of the Shop Talk Live next Friday. So look forward to speaking to them and having a discussion next Friday. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next week. Good afternoon.